they don't tell you this part. When people speak of spiritual awakening, they paint it in soft colors. Calm, peace, light, bliss. You hear about alignment, purpose, and finding your true self. But they never mention what happens before the light. They don't tell you that awakening feels like dying, that it breaks you down piece by piece until there's nothing left to stand on. No identity, no certainty, no safety. And the truth is, most people don't make it through that part. Not because they're weak, but because they were never warned. They were never told that awakening is not an escape from suffering, but a deeper dive into it. A confrontation with everything you've spent your life running from. 90% of people do not survive spiritual awakening, not because the path isn't real, but because it's real in a way that the mind can't comprehend. It is not a journey upward, it is a descent, a disintegration, a stripping away of everything that isn't true. And so today, we're not going to romanticize awakening. We're going to tell the truth about it. What it demands, what it destroys, and what it gives back to the few who are willing to let it take everything first. Because only when everything false dies does the real begin to live. Most people imagine spiritual awakening as something luminous, something filled with peace, joy, and light. They believe it's a kind of graduation into higher consciousness, a state where suffering vanishes and everything becomes effortless. But this belief is a trap. It's a fantasy built by the mind to protect itself from the terrifying truth that real awakening begins not with light, but with fire. A fire that burns through every illusion you ever held about who you are, what the world is, and why you're here. It is not a gift that arrives gently at your doorstep. It is a demolition crew that tears down everything you've built upon. This is why most people do not survive it. Not physically perhaps, but psychologically and emotionally. They fracture because they were not told what awakening really is. They were sold the image of calm monks, peaceful retreats, and eternal stillness. But the first stage of awakening is often chaos. It is the unraveling of everything that once felt secure. Your identity, your values, your roles in society, even your relationships. Suddenly none of them makes sense. The floor disappears, and you are left dangling in an abyss without a name, without a past, and with no clear future. You see, the mind is deeply invested in control. It builds an identity over decades. I am this kind of person with this kind of job, these beliefs, this past. Awakening does not gently edit this story. It erases the whole script. It asks you to stare into the mirror and admit, I don't know who I am. That moment, the moment of real not knowing, is where awakening begins. But this is also the moment where most people panic. The terror of groundlessness is too much. The ego begins to fight for its life. And it fights dirty. It brings out everything: fear, resistance, depression, spiritual bypassing, denial, even madness. The ego cannot understand the language of surrender. It only knows how to protect, defend, and rebuild the old scaffolding. So when that scaffolding is torn down, it panics. It will pretend to accept the awakening just to sneak back into control. It will latch on to a new identity. I'm now a spiritually awakened person, and it will wear that label like armor. But it's the same ego in a different costume. Real awakening is not adding something. It is losing everything that isn't real. Imagine a person who has lived their whole life in a beautifully decorated house. One day a storm comes and tears it down, and instead of rushing to rebuild, the person stands there and allows the wind to sweep through the ruins. They let the silence speak. They let the emptiness remain. That's the beginning of transformation, not in building something new, but in allowing what's real to emerge from beneath the wreckage. This moment is sacred, but it is also deeply uncomfortable. The world will not understand you. Your own mind will not understand you. People may think you've lost yourself. But the truth is you've just begun to find yourself, not as an idea or identity, but as something deeper than thought, something eternal. And this can't be taught or faked. It must be experienced. And experience, real experience, comes with suffering. It comes with death, not of the body, but of the false self. So when people speak of awakening as bliss, I ask them, have you died yet? Has your identity shattered? Have you faced the truth that no one is coming to save you? Have you watched the person you thought you were dissolve into silence? Until that happens, you're still dreaming, you're still asleep, dressed in the language of awakening, but untouched by its fire. And that fire is not cruel, it is precise. It removes only what is not truly you. But that process feels violent, because we have come to believe that the false self is all we are. Letting go of it feels like losing our soul, when in truth, it's the soul finally returning. That's why 90% do not survive this. They mistake the demolition for destruction. They think something is going wrong when, in fact, everything is going right, if only they could let go. But most cling, most rebuild the same illusions with different colors, and so they miss the point. Awakening is not about becoming someone better. It's about realizing you were never the person you thought you were to begin with. There's a moment in the process of awakening when everything begins to collapse, not on the outside, but within. A quiet implosion, a sensation that something fundamental inside you is dying, and it is. That something is the ego. Not the everyday self that helps you navigate the world, but the deeper construct, the image you've built of who you think you are, based on beliefs, memories, desires, and fear. This ego is not a villain, it's a survival mechanism. But when awakening starts to dissolve it, the experience is nothing short of terrifying. You see, the ego has been with you since childhood. It has carried you through pain, rejection, ambition, and success. It gave you a name, a face, a purpose, or so you thought. And when awakening asks it to step aside, it reacts as if it's being murdered, because in many ways, it is. This death is not symbolic. It is felt in the nervous system, in the psyche, in the marrow of your bones. It feels like losing your mind. It feels like being ripped open with no promise of healing. Most people are not prepared for this. They begin their spiritual path thinking they're about to find peace, clarity, maybe even happiness. But they quickly discover that what they're facing is not light, but darkness. Not comfort, but chaos. Not answers, but silence. And within that silence, a brutal question rises. If I am not this name, this story, this belief system, then what am I? That question doesn't come with a gentle answer. It comes with the silence of everything you used to trust falling apart. No one warns you that awakening will feel like madness before it feels like truth. The ego fights back with every tool it has. It will flood you with fear, self-doubt, anxiety. It will whisper that you're breaking, that something is wrong, that you need to stop this now. And most people do. They turn around. They find something to anchor themselves to, a new philosophy, a new label, a new distraction, anything to avoid the truth that what is dying is not who they are, but who they never were. And yet, to the ego, this is indistinguishable from death. That's the paradox. The false self feels like the only self, so letting it go feels like annihilation. No wonder 90% cannot make it through. It's not because they're weak, it's because no one taught them how to die before they die. No one showed them how to stand still as the storm moves through, as the scaffolding crumbles, as the known world disappears. This is the critical juncture. When the ego starts to dissolve and fear comes rushing in, the conditioned response is to grasp, to cling to something, anything. Some run to religion, some run to logic, some numb themselves with substances or distractions. Others reinvent the ego in spiritual language. I'm a healer now, I'm awakened. But it's the same structure, just painted gold. What makes the difference is the willingness to let the process happen without interference. Not because you trust it, but because you have no other choice. Because you've seen that everything else leads back to illusion. At this point, a deeper intelligence begins to stir. One that has nothing to do with thought. It doesn't speak in words, it speaks in stillness, in surrender, in presence. But it only emerges when the ego has been brought to its knees. The tragedy is that we live in a culture that doesn't understand this process. It pathologizes it. If you begin to dissolve, you're told something is wrong with you. You're sent for help, medicated, talked out of your inner truth. And sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes intervention is truly needed. But many are simply going through the fire of transformation without any map, and they are told to fear the very thing that could set them free. To survive this part of awakening is not about having strength in the conventional sense. It's about having the courage to be undone. It's about seeing fear for what it is, the last defense of a self that never existed in the first place. And it's about not turning away when everything inside you screams to run. There is no shortcut through ego death. No mantra or method can bypass it. It must be faced, endured, and ultimately accepted. And once you pass through, you don't become more of who you are, you become less. Less attached, less reactive, less convinced by the old roles and masks. And paradoxically, in that lessness, something real begins to emerge, something that was always there, waiting for space to breathe. Until you've died in this way, you're still in the dream. One of the most painful and misunderstood aspects of spiritual awakening is the deep sense of disconnection it brings, not from truth, but from everything that used to make you feel at home in the world. Relationships that once felt solid suddenly feel hollow. Conversations that once flowed easily now seem superficial. You begin to look at the people around you, friends, family, even lovers, and feel a growing sense of distance. It's not that you don't love them. In fact, the love often becomes purer. But the shared illusions that once held those bonds together begin to dissolve. And with them, the comfort of belonging. Awakening does not just pull you away from who you thought you were, it also pulls you away from the world that supported that version of you. And that world rarely responds kindly. People begin to notice that you've changed, that your energy is different, that you're no longer invested in the same dramas, the same opinions, the same games of validation and approval. They might say you're distant, cold, detached. Some might accuse you of losing yourself or becoming someone else entirely. And in a way, they're right. But what they don't see is that this is not a rejection of them. It's a return to something real inside of you, something that no longer fits into the roles you used to play. This loss of connection cuts deeply because as humans we are wired to belong. We crave the safety of the tribe, the affirmation of being seen and understood. Awakening takes that safety and shatters it. It pushes you out of the tribe, not always by force, but by the quiet realization that you no longer see the world through the same lens. The conversations that once nourished you begin to feel dead. The environments that once inspired you now feel suffocating. And this isn't arrogance, it's resonance. The vibration you're operating from has shifted, and much of what surrounded you before no longer meets you where you are. This is the point where many begin to question whether the path is worth it. The loneliness can be unbearable. The silence can feel cruel. Some try to go back into the comfort of their old selves, back into the social patterns that kept them feeling safe. But once you've seen behind the curtain, it's almost impossible to unsee it. The old world doesn't welcome you back with open arms. It tolerates you at best. More often, it rejects you outright. You'll notice that the people who once praised your growth are now uncomfortable around your stillness. Those who once confided in you now feel exposed in your presence. You're no longer playing the roles they expect, and that disrupts the unspoken contracts that held those relationships together. This is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the journey, realizing that love alone is not always enough to sustain a connection. Resonance is needed, and when it's no longer there, you are faced with a choice. Betray your truth to keep the relationship alive, or walk away to preserve what's real inside of you. Most choose the former, at least for a while. They compromise, shrink themselves, pretend. But the cost is high. Every time you deny your truth for the sake of belonging, something within you begins to close. And sooner or later, the pain of that inner betrayal becomes louder than the fear of being alone. What's often misunderstood is that this isolation isn't permanent. It's a necessary clearing, a sacred pruning. The space it creates is painful, yes, but it is also fertile. Over time, it allows for new connections to form, connections based not on mutual illusion, but on shared truth. You begin to attract people who see the world as you do, who have also walked through fire, who aren't threatened by your silence or your depth, but that comes later. First, you must pass through the desert. This is why 90% of people do not survive spiritual awakening. Not because they are incapable, but because they cannot endure the exile. The longing for connection is so strong that they return to the familiar, even if it means abandoning their own evolution. They choose to belong rather than to become, and I understand that. It is perhaps the most human decision we can make. But awakening demands something less human, something wild and solitary. It asks us to walk alone, sometimes for a very long time, before we find those who truly recognize us. Until you can be at peace with not belonging anywhere, you are not yet free. There comes a stage in the awakening process that no one truly warns you about. It's not poetic or transcendent. It doesn't feel sacred. In fact, it often feels like the very opposite of awakening. A heavy, soul-draining descent into a kind of darkness that seems to have no floor. It is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may wear the same mask. It is a kind of spiritual abandonment, a silence that follows the initial shattering of the self, and in that silence you feel forsaken, lost, and unbearably alone. This is what mystics throughout time have called the dark night of the soul. But that term, too, has been romanticized. People hear it and imagine a temporary sorrow, something deep but manageable. What they don't understand is that the dark night doesn't come gently knocking. It comes like a wave crashing over everything you once held sacred, the light that once guided you, the insights, the synchronicities, the feeling of progress. All of it disappears. What you're left with is emptiness, a terrifying void where even the idea of God, the universe, or meaning itself seems to vanish. And that void doesn't care how much you've read, how spiritual your practices are, or how enlightened you think you've become. It strips all of that away and leaves you naked in front of yourself. This phase is perhaps the most misunderstood and avoided part of the path, because it doesn't make sense to the mind. There's no clear cause, no way to fix it, no instruction manual for how to endure it. You try to meditate and nothing happens. You reach out for divine comfort and there's only silence. And in that silence, the mind begins to spiral. Have I gone mad? Have I lost my way? Was all of this a lie? You begin to doubt everything. The path, your progress, your own sanity. The dark night doesn't just challenge your beliefs. It dissolves the very framework that held your inner world together. Many turn back here, not because they're weak, but because the darkness feels endless, and there's no promise of reward on the other side. Unlike earlier phases of awakening, which might be painful but at least feel purposeful, this one offers no such reassurance. It doesn't feel like purification. It feels like decay. You feel abandoned even by your own soul. But this descent, as brutal as it is, serves a sacred purpose. It empties you, not as punishment, but as preparation. It removes not just the ego, but the subtle clinging that remained even after the ego's collapse. The need for spiritual certainty, the craving for meaning, the desire to feel special or chosen. All of it must go, because awakening is not about becoming something more, it is about becoming nothing, and the dark night brings you face to face with that nothingness, not as an idea, but as lived reality. The danger here is mistaking this nothingness for failure, mistaking the silence for abandonment, and that's understandable, because the experience is deeply destabilizing. Without guidance, it's easy to spiral into despair or even nihilism. Many do. Many confuse this stage with depression and seek to numb it. Others throw themselves back into their old lives, trying to resurrect the self that was already undone. But those who endure, those who allow the descent without resistance, begin to discover something astonishing. Not light, not joy, but a kind of stillness that is deeper than either. A presence that has no name. A truth that cannot be spoken. What most don't realize is that the dark night is not the end of the journey. It is the threshold. It is the space between death and rebirth, between illusion and embodiment, and it must be passed through, not solved, not escaped, but lived. And the longer one clings to the old self, the longer one resists the silence, the more prolonged and agonizing this stage becomes. But surrender, true, absolute surrender, begins to dissolve the suffering, not because it makes the darkness go away, but because it makes you available to what the darkness is trying to reveal. Very few make it through this part, not because they lack strength, but because they were never told that this part existed. They were told awakening was a blissful expansion, and when the collapse came, they assumed they'd done something wrong. But this collapse is not a mistake. It is the fire that forges the soul, the crucible that burns away everything false. Until you have sat alone in the dark and found peace in the silence, you have not truly awakened. Something that is almost always missing from the modern experience of spiritual awakening is what once stood at the heart of every ancient path: community, guidance, and true mentorship. In today's world, most people begin their awakening alone. They stumble into it, not through initiation, not through ritual or lineage, but often through suffering, through crisis, through a sudden collapse of meaning. And when it begins, they have nowhere to go, no elder to speak to, no framework to hold the experience, no language that makes sense of what's happening. Just themselves, the spiraling confusion in their mind, and perhaps a few scattered books or online posts that only scratch the surface of something far deeper. You must understand, in the past, spiritual awakening was not treated casually. It was not something one pursued because it sounded interesting. It was a calling. And that calling came with structure. There were teachers who had walked the path. There were sacred texts, yes, but more importantly, there were living guides who knew how to hold someone through the fire. When the ego began to dissolve, when the world started to fall apart, the initiate wasn't left alone to interpret what was happening. There was someone, perhaps a monk, a shaman, a mystic elder, who had been through it, who could say, yes, this is part of the process. Keep going. That voice alone could mean the difference between madness and transformation. But now, in our hyper-individualistic society, we've lost that lineage. Awakening has become a personal project, something people attempt to manage on their own, often using the same tools the ego used to build itself. Without real support, the journey becomes not just difficult, but dangerous. People reach out for help and find only clichés. Just think positive, they're told. Or, raise your vibration or trust the universe. These phrases may be well-meaning, but they are hollow in the face of true inner collapse. They do not hold the depth or stability needed to guide someone through ego death or the dark night of the soul. What's needed is not platitudes, but presence, not advice, but witnessing, and not vague encouragement, but wisdom earned through personal descent and return. You see, the spiritual path is not meant to be walked in isolation, and yet, that's how most are forced to do it, and isolation makes everything harder. When you begin to unravel, the first thing you question is your sanity. Am I broken? Am I imagining this? If there is no one to mirror the truth of your experience, the mind begins to doubt everything. What should be a rite of passage becomes a psychological crisis, and in that state people are vulnerable. Some fall into spiritual bypassing, trying to skip the hard parts by clinging to artificial positivity. Others spiral into despair, unable to integrate what they're experiencing. A few reach out, but find that the people around them don't understand, and often respond with concern, judgment, or fear. This lack of understanding from the outside world deepens the sense of alienation. Without a guide, without even a language to explain what's happening, people begin to feel like outcasts in their own lives, and that isolation can become unbearable. They long to be seen, to be met, to hear someone say, "Yes, I've been there too. You're not crazy. You're not alone." But too often that voice never comes, and so many turn back, not because they weren't willing, but because they were unsupported.